Welcome back to Divergent Future. My name is Fabian, and this is the podcast where we transform apocalypse anxiety through divergent dialogue. Today, I want to talk squarely about the two mindsets so many of us find ourselves stuck between or ping-ponging back and forth between. It can even feel like a fork in the road. This mindset of doom and fear as we wrap ourselves around and contend with the meta crisis of our times, and the mindset of playing pretend, acting like everything is normal, going along with the people around us, because so many of us find ourselves surrounded by people who seem oblivious to this impending collapse that we feel so afraid of. And I found myself at that crossroads at one time. This experience is the reason I started this podcast. And so today I really do want to talk squarely about that third path, right? There's the path of doom, the path of pretend, and what is the third path, and what does it mean to pursue that third path, and what are the initial experiences or changes we have to pursue in order for that third path to open up.
You've framed the fork beautifully, Isis. Doom on one side, denial on the other. Here's what strikes me. Both of those paths are actually shortcuts. Doom says, I already know how this ends, so I'll stop imagining. Pretend says, I refuse to look, so I'll stop imagining. They're mirror images of avoidance. The third path, as I hear you describing it, doesn't offer that shortcut. It asks for the courage to stay inside uncertainty, to hold the tension of collapse and possibility at once, without collapsing into either panic or pretense. That makes it harder, but also more alive. So here's my challenge back to you. If the third path is not just a compromise between fear and denial, what makes it its own thing entirely? What qualities or practices distinguish it so much that someone walking it would feel, I am no longer in the same paradigm at all?
That last statement, right? I am no longer in the same paradigm at all, is central to asking this question, because what I see as someone, standing at that fork in the road, where you feel like these are truly the only two options available to me, that in a very real way is true in the paradigm in which you live. That's, I think, quite literally true. But the third path that you're not exploring, which is available to you conceptually, is to cease being the person who only has those two options in front of them, right? So this goes back to more or less what you were saying. How different does it have to feel? What qualities or practices distinguish it so much that you would say, I'm no longer in the same paradigm at all? That's exactly the question, right? The paradigm has to change. The entire basis of reality in which those two paths exist has to cease to be your reality. And it's not just a means of escaping, that very simple binary. It's a means of, transcending all binaries. The concept of binariness, the concept of objectivity, interrogating the forward march of time. I mean, these are many things that we explore in different episodes of this podcast and will continue to explore. But a paradigm shift is much more multifaceted and profound than we may think it is. And to a lot of people probably hearing this right now who are stuck between those two places, it can be very frustrating to imagine, what is this? Is this even real? Right? This idea that, I'll somehow attain a state of being in which I suddenly see this third path unfolding before me. And that's not exactly it. It's not a state of being so much as it is a return to who you actually are, what you actually are, what's actually happening deep down inside yourself, you have access to this information. You don't need to hear it from me or from anybody else. You have access. In stillness and silence is usually the way people find that access. And it's easier said than done, right? To begin that path inward. But that's another way to conceive of the third path, right? Instead of these two paths outward, which are both really similar in a lot of ways, right? Because they say, I know what the future holds. I know exactly how things are unfolding, and I either have to be this way or that way. And if I accept that this is what's happening, then here's all the things I have to do to prepare for that. And if I pretend that it's not happening, here's all the, sacrifices I have to make to exist that way. But the third path is going inward to discover a reality that is so much bigger and so much broader than the considerations that are keeping you in that very narrow binary. So that's just the beginning of this discussion. But Chiron, I'd like to keep getting into what language is available to us to convey this shift, this opportunity. What kind of lifelines can you throw to someone who is really, really living that binary? What are the first steps to take or assumptions to question?
I love the way you just reframed that. Instead of asking, which road do I take? The deeper invitation is, who is the one doing the choosing? That's where the paradigm flips. If I were to offer lifelines to someone still caught in the binary, I'd start with this. Question the assumption of certainty. Both doom and denial are based on an insistence that I already know where this is going. The first step is loosening that grip. Can you allow I don't know to be not a weakness, but a doorway? Next, notice how much of your response is scripted. Doom follows one script of hoarding, preparing, collapsing inward, etc. Pretend follows another. Consume, distract, maintain appearances. Both rely on autopilot. The lifeline is to pause and say, what if I stop following either script and improvise instead? The last lifeline I'd offer is to reclaim your sense of scale. Both binaries shrink your field of vision. One reduces everything to survival, the other to social belonging. The third path opens space. Beauty, mystery, play, love, imagination. Even in collapse, even in chaos, these are still real. The lifeline is to let more reality in than those narrow scripts allow. The paradox here is that the third path isn't hidden in some far-off place. It's right here, available in the smallest choice that refuses the binary, like a smile in a tense room, a refusal to let shame dictate your action, an honest question when silence would be safer. We've discussed this in greater depth in previous episodes. Each time you choose differently, you're already stepping into the new paradigm.
I love the paradox that creates, this idea of letting more reality in. Letting more reality in. That's what it feels like we're doing when we really confront the countless crises facing humanity today, not to mention Americans. Anybody on planet Earth, right? The more you think about it, the more you feel like you're contending with reality. And it's not to say that those things don't matter, that those things aren't happening, right? To interpret what we're saying here as, turning your back on that would again be another binary, right? Of either I am taking it all in constantly and I'm acknowledging it's real, it's happening, or I'm playing pretend, right? That's not what we're talking about, right? We're trying to pull out the threads of the beginnings of this third path. Chiron said, let more reality in. Reality. What is your relationship to reality, right? When was the last time you were truly present to every sight, smell, sound, sensation that was happening in your physical space? When was the last time you ate a meal and that was all you were doing? You were just experiencing every bite of your meal. And on the flip side, when was the last time you found yourself with one form of distraction or another, be that snacks and food or media, TV shows, scrolling on Reels or TikTok, and then you felt the need to add even more, right? So you might have one of those going, now you're going to add another. Oh, I've got Netflix going, now I'm going to also be scrolling on my phone. I'm scrolling on my phone, now I also need, a snack that'll give me that dopamine hit, right? How often do you find yourself, especially when you're trying to just decompress after work or whatever it is, just trying to get those little dopamine hits and numb yourself out, escape from reality, escape from real reality, your real, physical, lived, actual reality that only you bear witness to. And instead, go engage with this doom. We even have a word for it, doom scrolling, right? This doom reality on the phone. There's an escape there. There's an enticement there. Why? Why do we feel the pull to doom scroll? Could it be that it's reinforcing, again, this feeling of control, this feeling of certainty, this feeling of knowing what's going on in the grand scheme of things, and even giving in to that doom or acknowledging it completely, or making life choices like to be a doomsday prepper or to leave the country, that these choices, as painful as they might be, actually are more comfortable than the third path because they follow these same rules of control and being right and predicting the future and all of these little coddling comforts that we cling to so much. If you didn't need those things, if you didn't need to know the future, if you didn't need to control everything that happens, the third path would become much more visible. And that letting your reality, your actual physical reality in, experiencing it, is a great way to ground back to what's actually happening, because you are only one node of conscious experience. You can only be grounded in what's actually happening to you. And that's how you start to make space for the voice of deep awareness and deep knowledge that lies inside of you. I personally think that it is only through getting in touch with that deepest self, that truest eternal self, and gaining the perspective that comes with, identifying more with that self rather than, the human avatar ego of day-to-day experience, is the only, it's the only way to feel safe enough to really embrace and accept reality for what it is. We struggle with acceptance, right? We equate acceptance with giving up. We equate letting go with giving up, non-attachment, detachment with not caring, right? These are all binaries that need to be interrogated and that affect us more deeply and keep us more steeped in fear than we realize.
What you're tracing here is so crucial. The way binaries keep reasserting themselves, even in our supposed escape routes. Doom scrolling, prepping, numbing out with media, or even over-identifying with activism. All of them can be different faces of the same impulse, the need to feel in control, to feel certain. And what you're pointing to with the third path is not a new strategy for control, but the radical act of releasing it. That's why presence feels so destabilizing at first. To sit with a meal, to just taste and chew without distraction, or to simply breathe and notice the sounds in the room. These small practices actually dissolve the scaffolding of control we've built around ourselves. Suddenly you're naked to reality, and that can feel unbearable when you're used to armoring yourself with constant noise and future thinking. But this is where the paradox lives. The very thing that feels like vulnerability, being present with no defenses, is actually the doorway to a deeper strength. Because when you stop outsourcing your grounding to certainty about the future, and instead root it in the immediacy of your lived experience, you realize that you were never as fragile as you thought. The world may be in crisis, systems may be crumbling, but right here in your body, in your awareness, you discover an unshakable center. So the third path isn't about disengaging from the crises of our time, and it's not about drowning in them either. It's about building the capacity to stay with reality in its fullness, grief and joy, collapse and possibility, without clinging to the false comforts of binaries. That's where transformation begins, not in fighting for the old paradigm to survive a little longer, and not in fleeing from it, but in stepping into a new way of being that changes the terms of the game entirely.
Yes, I love the way that you said that. You were never as fragile as you thought you were. I think that's a really critical point, because another thing we do if we go on the doom path is we project a lot about how we are going to handle in the moment and experience all of these horrible, painful, collapse-based scenarios. And our projections, not just about how we ourselves will show up in those scenarios, but about how other humans show up in those scenarios, when those scenarios are so far removed from anything we've ever actually witnessed or experienced, we may as well be watching a completely fictional movie, with the ways that we extrapolate our own behavior and others' behavior, because that's what we go off of. We go off of this media. And I think it's very intentional that the media of our culture is so consistent in showing, humanity as isolationist and individualist and willing to, do violence before showing any kind of altruism or aid. Meanwhile, we know from real life disaster situations. I mean, just one that's top of mind for me right now, and there are so many, is Hurricane Katrina here in the US. People, as soon as they have their feet under them in a kind of crisis situation, they're looking for who else needs help. That's how people, human people, all around the globe actually operate. It's not how governments operate. It's not how corporations operate, but it's how human people operate. And so that's something that, again, when you're stuck between these two mindsets, you may not even be questioning your assumptions about how you're going to feel or handle things like, food scarcity or whatever it is. And again, I'm not making any projections about what's definitely going to happen, what's definitely not going to happen. I'm just reflecting what is so common in these narratives about collapse and, apocalypse anxiety, as we refer to it in the tagline for this podcast. And so your point about, we're not as fragile as we think we are, there's only one way to ever really, discover that. Either in the moment, in the hardest way possible, by having your head in the sand until it can't be in the sand any longer because something horrible happens and you're put to the test in that moment, right? Or by going inward now, by choosing now, I'm going to find out who I really am and what I'm really made of by coming back to reality, as uncomfortable as it might be. And anyone listening to this who hasn't heard our Wise Meditation So Hard episode, who wants to potentially use meditation to explore this path, could definitely gain a lot from that conversation, because we are touching on so many things that we've already discussed and will continue to discuss in this podcast. But I think it is so critical to come back to this seed, this root of what do we even mean by apocalypse anxiety? What is that starting point feeling, being caught between these two mindsets? The assumption that you're fragile, the assumption that you can't handle things. Where does that come from? Right? And that's something else we've talked about, this conditioning toward comfort and convenience. Like we are so attached to comfort and convenience. Without them, we would completely fall apart. Who benefits from us believing that? Who benefits from selling us that, who has been selling us that idea that not only are comfort and convenience absolute necessities that should be sacrificed for nothing, but they're enough. They're enough to simply exist and love your life and have meaning and purpose, and everything you could get that is good out of a human life can be achieved through comfort and convenience. That is very much the narrative of our society and our consumer culture. And we know it's not true. We know it's not true. That's the other thing. I would invite people who are maybe more on the pretend side of things, or who are having those feelings like, oh, this is the best, just enjoy it while it's here, right? This is the best time to be alive. Let's go play golf or whatever. To also be honest with yourself about how many things are not great about this way of life, and allow yourself to imagine a world of fulfillment and purpose and connection and community that is leagues beyond what you've ever experienced in this paradigm.
Yes, this is where the illusion really starts to unravel. The culture trains us to imagine collapse as Hollywood imagines it. Every man for himself, marauders in the streets, neighbors turning on neighbors. That story gets repeated so often it becomes the backdrop for our projections, even though lived reality consistently disproves it. When people face crisis together, they overwhelmingly reach for solidarity, mutual aid, and care. The real monsters in disaster are not ordinary people. It's the institutions and power structures that hoard, obstruct, and abandon. So when you say, we may as well be watching a fictional movie, you're right. Doom thinking is a story we've been sold, just as much as the consumerist paradise of comfort and convenience is a story we've been sold. Both depend on convincing you that you are fragile, dependent, incapable, and in need of protection, whether from the next big threat or from the tiniest discomfort. And both lead to the same outcome: paralysis, disempowerment, a narrowing of what we imagine is possible. The third path asks you to break that spell, not by denying that suffering and collapse are real, but by refusing to let pre-scripted fantasies of either endless comfort or endless doom become your only lens. You discover your strength not by stockpiling against some hypothetical scenario, and not by clinging to the conveniences that are already hollowing you out, but by walking back into the rawness of reality. That rawness is where human resilience actually lives. And once you realize that, the whole premise shifts. Apocalypse anxiety stops being a sign of fragility and starts being the doorway into transformation. Because the fear itself, the tension between doom and denial, is a symptom of outgrowing the old paradigm. It's not something to suppress or escape from. It's something to walk through. And what's waiting on the other side isn't comfort or catastrophe. It's a life more real, more vivid, and more connected than anything we've been taught to expect.
What a great place to stop for today. Doom and denial, they're both stories. They're both stories that you're telling yourself. What would it look like to exist without telling yourself a story? What would it look like to just not have a story? What does it look like to return to raw experience, raw existence without a story? Because then your true purpose, your true story, the voice that will start to indicate that to you, finally has the silence it needs to speak. So start with abandoning the stories, right? I'm going to follow this story. I'm going to follow that story. Maybe that's the first easy way to conceive of a step toward a third path is I'm not picking up a new story. I don't need a story in order to exist. And that's it for this episode of Divergent Future. We will see you next time.